Welcome back to Light Up the Darkness podcast. I'm your host, Erin Edwards. On today's episode, we'll be tackling the subject of grief and healing through grief and what that can look like. With all the things going on in the world and some very personal things happening with me, I thought it would be a great time to discuss this topic. Just a little disclaimer before you get into the episode. You may hear some loud banging and clangs in the background, but just a reminder, I live in New York City, and so does my guest. And, there's some construction, so bear with us. And with that, we'll get right into the episode. Our guest today is Naiylah Warren, LMFT, a licensed marriage and family therapist. She previously appeared on this podcast in the episodes about moving through racial trauma. She's going to talk to us today about grief and what healing could look like through grief. She's thoughtful and empathic, and I couldn't be more thrilled to have her back on the show. Welcome back to Light Up the Darkness, Nye.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. First of all, that intro was so sweet and kind. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. It's true. I'm really excited to talk to you. So before we get into the subject, can we get a little bit about what's going on in your career and what you're working on right now?
Yeah, so right now I am currently a clinical content manager at a mental health company by the name of Ny-eel-ah. And so there I oversee a lot of the clinical content and therapeutic content that we create for our programming, as well as contributing to a bunch of other projects there, like our pathways. So that's really exciting. Outside of that, I do a lot of corporate wellness workshops still. So I do a lot about still racial trauma. Imposter syndrome has been a big theme coming up lately. I'm doing a lot of workshops around that. And then I'm still seeing some of my individual clients as well. So I'm got my toes in a little bit of everything.
Nice. Okay, so let's move on to the subject at hand. As you know, and as we talked about previously, there's just been so much going on in the world, a lot of loss for many people, and it just keeps happening. We're talking about the mass shootings and the hate crimes that have been occurring. And there's just a lot of people out here who are struggling and grieving. And so I thought it'd be a good time to just talk to someone like you about grief and what healing can look like through that. So maybe we can start out with like a clinical description of grief.
Ooh, the clinical description of grief. I mean, I think I would probably start with really just talking about this from an emotional lens and the true emotional sorrow and absence of someone close to you. I think the way that I would define it is truly sort of zeroing in on the experience of that emotional loss, that emptiness. Clinically, we would say that this is depression. And now we have even more terms like complicated grief or prolonged grief and things like that. But really the way that I would tend to describe it is sort of that emotional sorrow due to the absence of someone that you love, someone really close to you. But I think there's a lot of different ways that we can define it, right? Because that's from an individual perspective. But if we think about grief from a communal or collective perspective, we see that it's not just about losing one particular person or having that sort of absence sort of be, reign in your life, but having various things, various degrees of loss happen to your community, whether that be people that look like you, whether that be certain circumstances or opportunities that can cause that same level of sorrow on a communal level and on a collective level. So I think there's a few different ways that we can conceptualize grief. We tend to think about it more from that individual perspective, but I do think from a collective lens, we can see that we can experience a lot of those same things from in within our community, within our communities and within our collective as well.
Yeah, so maybe we can jump into that topic. This idea of a collective grief versus what would be more of a personal grief. Like, what does that mean to experience collective grief?
Well, I think it looks like when, for example, we had the shooting in Buffalo, right?
Hmm.
And we look at how there are many people within the Black community who may not have known any of those who passed away personally, right? But there
Yeah.
is a level of association that you have with, one, the fact that they are people that look like you, two, that they are people that are targeted because they look like you.
Hmm.
Three, this is also connecting to a deep, dark, and very heavy historical past with instances like this, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think that that can trigger a lot of those feelings of sorrow as well, even though that's not that sort of individual connection to those individuals, but there is this communal connection that you have. And I think
Hmm.
when we lose that, or when we have those kind of experiences, it can definitely trigger those feelings of sorrow, those feelings of emptiness, those feelings of disillusionment. Like, I don't even know what I'm doing anymore, right? A lot of people
Right.
are talking to me about feeling just really numb, of like, I don't even know how to feel about this, right?
Hmm.
A
Hmm.
lot of anger, all of the ways that we see grief showing up in any capacity, we also see that in that communal and collective experience. So that's what I would say to that there.
Yeah, I can definitely concur with feeling angry when
Mm-hmm.
that happened in Buffalo in particular, and when the shooting happened in Texas, it's just like this
Yeah.
intense feeling of anger, and you don't really know what to do with it. Um, and I think that talking to someone like you is helpful because a lot of times we just sit and we like stew in these feelings and we don't really know how to deal with it. So, what are
Yeah.
some ways that you advise others when they're dealing with something like that? Those feelings that are sometimes confusing when it comes to the collective grief.
Yeah. I think I think in tackling grief, I think the thing that is very nuanced about it is that it shows up very differently
Hmm.
for everyone, and yet it shows up the same,
Right,
right?
right.
So I think across the board, we can see that we may have a lot of those same feelings in common, but we may experience them at different stages. We may have an experience where we actually are not able to really process what's happening. We may stay in a state of shock or disillusionment for a long period of time. We may feel numb for a long period of time. And I think those things will ebb and flow based on the individual.
Hmm.
Um, but I think as a collective, when we think about what are things that we can do, I think one, there is a level of identifying and naming
Mm, yeah,
exactly what's coming up. These things, especially now, like these mass shootings, they're happening so often at this point that it can be really hard for people to provide themselves any space to actually even process what's going on.
yeah,
Like I mentioned before, so many of the folks that I've been working with, or even just colleagues, friends, a lot of folks are feeling a lot of that anger, but also a lot of that disconnection from it, almost of like, well,
yeah.
it's another day, right?
Hmm.
And I think that can be in a lot of ways a coping mechanism for us to sort of create space between ourselves and what's happening in the world. To some degree that can be healthy, but to another degree, when it gets to the point where we are not acknowledging that pain or that anger, whatever that looks like,
Hmm.
that when we start to see that sort of showing up in different areas in our lives, and that's when we want to start to process.
Right.
So I think one, it's a long way of saying, first identifying and creating space to process. I think especially if we're thinking about this on a communal level, what are identifying community spaces
Mm,
where we can actually talk about what's been happening, like when the Buffalo shooting happened, when the Uvalde shooting happened, like what communal spaces do we have to actually talk about this outside of
right.
social media or Instagram, right? Or outside of your homes or your friendship circles, right?
Hmm.
Those could be incredibly healing spaces for folks to really talk through what's happening for them. I
Yeah.
think I see a lot of corporate companies sort of doing things like this. And I think that's a really good first step, but finding those spaces, I think is so important,
Mm-hmm.
to be able to just talk through what's happening for you. And then I think the other part is engaging in some of your coping tools, really leaning back on the future. I know oftentimes when people are experiencing really heavy things and hard things, it can be hard to feel like you know how to cope. But
Mm-hmm.
truly a big part, especially in therapy, is reminding folks, no, you do know how to cope, right?
Mm-hmm.
That, right now, sort of when we get off kilter, we kind of forget what are the things that we usually do to help us move through difficult things.
Right.
And reminding ourselves of, okay, well, what do I do when I'm feeling sad? What do I do when all I want to do is go to bed, right? There's that meme of like, I just want to go lay down.
Yeah.
But what do we do when those moments are happening, right? And so I
Right.
think, one, looking to your individual coping skills, whether that's leaning on your community, talking to your friends, whether that's getting out in nature, whether that's doing your spiritual practices, or your religious practices, whether that's doing things that just, baseline help you function, taking a shower, making sure
Mm-hmm.
you eat a snack, like those kinds of things. I
Mm-hmm.
think they're really, really important to remember of. That's also how we pour into ourselves. So that's another long way of saying
Yeah.
moving on and looking back on our previous coping tools, can be really, really helpful and grounding. And also talking to others to hear how they are moving through it as well,
Right.
um, can be really important. But I also want to caution folks that we don't need a bunch of tools in our tool belt all the time, right? Because sometimes
Mm-hmm.
it's like I need to like know all the new things to do,
Mm-hmm.
try everything, right? And every tool will have its limitations, and that's why we want to use them, holistically, so that way we can see it work its best. But even if you just have one thing that you always go to, or two things, or three things, starting with that, I think, is really, really important, and that, I think, will get us really far.
Yeah, I love that. You're always reminding us to pour into ourselves. I remember on that last episode, you were like, your skincare routine is
Yeah.
so important. Like that's something you can do to move through the racial trauma, which was a different subject, but a similar way to cope through something tough. Yeah.
And it's not to make it sound light and fluffy, right? it's
Yeah.
it's really to like remind us that those types of things are also the things that we tend to lose when we're processing heavy feelings, right? And that
Mm-hmm.
also makes us feel like we're back in our lives when we're starting to do these things that were a part of our regular routines. So I
Yeah.
think when folks are going through stuff, those are some of the first things that tend to go, right? They stop sleeping, they stop eating,
Mm-hmm.
they isolate. And so, if as much as we can sort of get back into those things and incorporate that, I think that's how we actively combat some of those heavy feelings.
Yeah. Back to basics.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, okay, so in terms of personal grief, which you already identified as it can mean a number of different things, not necessarily just losing or the absence of a loved one. It can be the absence of other sorts of things. What can we do when we are dealing with something personally? I know it's probably similar, but
Mhm.
uh, for example, in the midst of all of this stuff going on in our country,
Mhm.
all of these tragedies, I recently lost my mother,
Mhm.
and so it was kind of like a one-two punch of
Yeah.
of like
Right.
grief and me having to figure out what's in my tool box or tool or kit, so to speak, like you
Mhm.
mentioned. And what do you have any suggestions for people who are kind of like overwhelmed by it all?
Absolutely. I think, one, when we experience, and I just want to note again, I know we talked about this before this, but I just want to send my condolences to you as well, because I know losing a parent is never, ever the thing that is what you predict or what you expect or what you want to deal with. So I just want to
Yeah,
hold space for that.
thank you. I appreciate it.
Um, when we are experiencing the overwhelm that can come from losing someone, especially someone who was such a big part of our lives, someone who was a big part of our routine, there is this emptiness that we can sometimes feel because we can feel their void, right? And I think when you talk about that feeling of overwhelm, that can often come from feeling like I have to figure out how to fill all of this space. And I think that is a very I think it's a very beautiful goal, but I think a pre-step before that is identifying how can I hold space for myself, for my sadness, for these heavy and low moments. Oftentimes, and we talked about this before, that oftentimes when someone passes away, you kind of like just jump right back into life, right?
Right.
And you
Mm-hmm.
sort of your moments of grief come like in the morning and the evening, and then wherever you can fit in like an ugly cry, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that can be, I think, to some degree, really dismissive of the heaviness that you're carrying throughout the day. And I think having space, and you as an individual, whoever's listening to this, having creating those spaces, if it's accessible to you, is so important and crucial.
Yeah.
And then also creating spaces where you can move out of that heaviness, because also you don't always want to sit there either, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That there is an ebb and flow that you're going to move back and forth through, and allowing yourself to be in that space without having to do anything else.
Right.
And I think one big thing is taking the responsibility to feel like you have to do anything else except for grieve in that moment, in those times where you are able to, because sometimes when things like that happen, you kind of jump into survival mode and you have to get all these things together.
Mm-hmm.
But those moments in those spaces that you do have that, is so important to just allow yourself to be, because that really helps us to move through these feelings. And they will come back, and sometimes they come back at a higher volume, right, with more emotionality, sometimes with less. So just allowing ourselves that compassion to say, it's okay that I'm sad that I lost something,
Right.
and it's okay that I don't want to get out of bed because I lost something, and it's okay that I am struggling today because I lost something. And I think that those being able to affirm yourself in that is so important, because
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes life will make us feel like we have to just keep going, and sometimes we do have to take that pause.
Yeah. Life and the people around you sometimes will make you feel
Uh,
like your time is up. You've had enough time grieving, and someone else told me this, but it's important to remember there's no timeline for grief.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
um,
that's true. I think
yeah.
throughout our lives, the form it takes will look different,
Mm-hmm.
and the impact that a story or a photo or a memory or a certain experience will have may look a little bit different. And that's what we can see as our way of sort of making progress through some of these things. But sometimes it will still be heavy, right? So
Yeah.
I think we just sort of learn to live with carrying that, and getting to a place of hopefully at some point making meaning of it,
Mm-hmm.
and being able to allow that to be how we maintain and move forward.
Right. Yeah. It's great. So, can we talk about some like healthy ways to move through grief, maybe from your own personal experience? I can start if you want.
Yeah.
um, in my early 20s, I lost someone who raised me for part of my life. It was the first time I've ever lost a loved one that close to me, and at that time, I had never, as an adult, went to therapy.
Mhm.
And that experience of loss kind of propelled me forward in my like mental health journey in general. So it was like a window into realizing that I need to really take care of my mental health. Um, so that my grieving exposed me to mental health healing and being better about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think oftentimes a lot of these experiences can lead us to mental health support. And I think that that is a big way that we can find a space to help us cope. When you asked about healthy ways, I think therapy is a really great tool for that, because I often say that, to the example that you brought up about how a lot of times the people around you, they put a deadline on when you are to be done with being sad, right?
Right, right.
And oftentimes in therapy spaces, that space is fully just for you to just be. And a lot of folks don't have that, and a lot of us period don't have spaces where it's just for us, just to be, just to center our own story and our own narratives and think through that. And so I think that that's a really, really helpful space. I also think group therapy spaces are really beautiful. Like, I know that there is someone who has Black Folks Grieve, which is a space that they created. And I think that having those kind of support spaces are really important as well,
Yeah.
because they also bring in that sort of therapeutic, that group support experience. Support groups, other support groups as well, I think are really important. But I think when we get into some other ways to cope, I think one, your support system is really, really important. Having folks around you who can just kind of be with you, not necessarily always fix it, but then sometimes you might want to fix her in there too. Like, I really cannot like make myself a meal today. Like, sometimes, like, and you want that friend to be like, hey, like, I just door dashed you some food, right? Like,
Yeah.
having a support system around you who can sort of assist you in meeting your needs, I think is really, really important, especially when we get to those places where it's really, really hard for us to do those things
Mhm.
ourselves, show up in that way. I think also another thing is having some self-compassion for yourself again. I think that's one of the biggest things, is being gentle with yourself,
Mhm.
um, embracing all of your feelings and emotions, knowing that there's no time limit, knowing there's no set date, for you to be over this or done this. There's no grieving too long, right?
Mhm.
Allowing yourself to look at some of your routines, right? Look at your sleep schedule. Okay, well, are you sleeping a lot? Are you sleeping too little, right?
Mhm.
How are some changes that can be made to that, right?
Mhm.
Or some things that you can do to help either help you sleep more or get you up a little bit earlier so you can jump into life and do some of the things that will be a little bit more activating, right?
Yeah.
I think folks say a lot of times, getting into those regular other self-care routines, moving your body a bit, going different places, allowing yourself to experience certain things. I think those are, and I want to be very real about this, I think those are really good depending on the stage that you're in and where
Mm.
you are. But truthfully, when we experience grief, it can be very deactivating for us, meaning we don't want to do anything. I don't want to see anyone. I don't want to go anywhere. I don't want to talk to anyone. And so it can
Yes.
feel really hard to think that the goal for the day is to go out to dinner with a friend, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so I think finding ways to adjust that, right? Maybe for you that day is just talking to one of your friends. Maybe that day is just going outside and going for a walk. Maybe
Mhm.
that day it's just taking a shower.
Mhm.
Maybe that day is allowing yourself space to cry, right? Because some folks may do the opposite and feel like they're cramming so much in their day so that they don't have to think about it, right?
Right.
So identifying those small benchmarks for you, I think, is really important. And that's where we talk about grief being a very individual experience, because everyone will experience this very differently. And so
Mhm.
what moving through it or coping through it looks like for one person may look completely different for someone else.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, what are some pitfalls you've seen when it comes to the grieving process that you would like want people to look out for in their experience?
I mean, coming from an addiction background, I would say that that's one that feels top of mind for me. A lot of the folks that I used to work with when I was working in addictions would often turn to substances as a way to cope because it helped them kind of avoid those heavy feelings. And I
Yeah.
think it's a very accessible way to feel like, this is helping me in some way, but that can actually become a much bigger issue at some point. So really like taking that into account, being mindful of your substance use around times of grief and sorrow. And a lot of folks will mention that they do drink more, they do smoke more, they do other substances. And that is understandable and a fair. But I do like to sort of have folks to really think about that and sort of caution them around that kind of stuff.
Mm.
Um, just to make sure that that actually doesn't become a much bigger issue later on. That doesn't happen for everyone, but it is something that I do think it can happen to anyone. I mean, just from speaking personally, I do think that that is something that just to be cautious about.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is isolation.
Mm.
Um, I think that's one that we don't always necessarily see how cautionary that can also be. While taking space for yourself, again, it's a slippery slope like everything else. Taking space for yourself can be really important and empowering and actually help you sort of process. But a little bit too much of that could actually create, I think, even more depression in folks. And so, something that I would say is really try to think about how to balance those moments where you want to be to yourself, but then when you're also like engaging with others. And engaging with others doesn't mean that you are with a bunch of people that you don't know, don't like, don't want to talk to, right? Engaging with other people really looks like, you connecting with folks that you trust, that you feel connected to, even if it's just a 5-minute convo, 10-minute convo, making sure that, you have eyes and ears on you
Mhm.
and you have eyes and ears on the people that you feel closest to as well, I think can be really, really helpful at that.
Mm.
So those are the two that come top of mind to me.
What you mentioned the that some people may lean towards keeping busy every moment they can as a way to
Yeah.
cope. Do you see that as healthy, or is that like, like a
You know,
little?
I don't think in any capacity suppressing your feelings is healthy,
Mhm.
but I will say that I see how it is functional.
Mhm. Okay.
And I'm going to make that distinction because I do think that there are times when, and I talk about this when we talk about things like different like collective traumas, right? That sometimes our feelings can be inconvenient when you're in the process
Mhm.
of trying to survive a hard thing, right? It can feel like your feelings are getting in the way of you surviving something.
Mhm.
And so, for example, when we're dealing with certain traumas, we may feel numb, we may feel disconnected or disassociated,
Mhm.
right? To help us move through that experience. But it's then after making sure that we have time to process, right?
Right.
And so for those folks who tend to keep themselves busy, I think that there's a function to that, right? And that this may be the thing that they're using to help them get through a hard thing, which with all the things that I talked about, right? With substances the same way, isolation the same way. But when we think about when are we then allowing ourselves to actually get reconnected and to process what's going on? I think that's the thing that I think is really most
Yeah.
important. So I do think that busyness can also be detrimental because I think it'll just burn you out really quickly.
Mhm.
And it's not that your feelings aren't there, and it's not that they're going away in any of these examples. It's really that we are just sort of keeping that door closed to them, and we're like kicking that door shut,
Mhm.
and we're trying to, but our feelings are still trying to come out, and they're going to come out.
Yeah.
Busyness just sort of stockpiles it
Yeah.
in the back, and then all of a sudden they sort of come out like a roar, right?
Mhm.
And that's something that we also want to be mindful of. So yeah, I do agree that that can also be a way. But I just wanted to preface that I think all of those
Mhm.
scenarios serve a function, which is to help you survive.
Mhm.
But we want to be mindful about to what extent will that help me to survive this hard moment versus like when that will become detrimental to my overall healing.
Okay, so let's maybe wrap it up with some takeaways for the people from this.
Yeah.
Like what would you what's a good takeaway you would want people to have from this conversation?
I can't stress this enough, and I think that this may be also top of mind because I also have a friend who's struggling with grief right now,
Mhm.
and the one thing that's just so on my heart is to give yourself some grace and be gentle with yourself,
Mm.
and first and foremost have self compassion, knowing that this is a hard thing. It's not an easy thing. It's not something that you should be able to do by yourself. It's not something that you should be able to get over in the next few weeks. It's not something that should not have an impact on you. And if it does, it doesn't mean anything wrong or bad about you.
Mhm.
Um, it just means that you're a human being. And I think that's one thing that I really like to remind people that, as they're carrying this, it's okay to be gentle with yourself while you're carrying this load.
Mhm.
Um, Something else that I would also say is connecting with community. I think, again, that's something that's so important. And community could look like those community outlets that you have, whether that's therapy, whether that's Reiki, whether that's whatever it is that
Mm-hmm.
folks are connected to, that give you a sense of solace. Also, activities and also people that generate hope.
Mm.
Because when you can be around people who sort of provide a level of perspective or a feeling for you that generates that hopefulness and that I can get through this, that's really, really important to get you through those really tough days.
Yeah.
So I think company matters, the things that you do matter, with the hope of generating hope. Is really important. And then lastly, just those like very typical, very tangible human things. So finding ways to get in the shower and making sure that you're eating and
Mm-hmm.
checking in with your sleep. Some of those things will not be the same way that it was. So the goal is not to get 8 hours. If, before grief, you were sleeping like a good 8 and now you're sleeping like a good 4, right? The goal is not to get you back to 8 just yet,
Mm-hmm.
but to allow you to be able to be gentle with yourself in that time and find different ways to get you the rest that you need if it's not happening in that capacity. So really just a lot of negotiating with yourself through this process.
Yeah, definitely. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a takeaway. And what I got from everything you said was, when you described grief as, dealing with this absence of, someone you love or whatever it might be, something that you've become accustomed to being there every day. I think a good way to deal with that would be to remember what they left behind. And that's like the love and everything that you got from that person or whatever it is that you lost. And it's a good way to feel hopeful also.
Oh, I love that so much.
Yes, I
So
got that
much.
from you.
Yeah.
Um, okay, well, that's pretty much it. Is there anything that you are working on that we should look out for, or do you want people to maybe follow you on social media?
You know what? I am in the process. Folks can still follow me, but I am on a social media break right now.
Okay.
So a much needed Instagram cleanse, but you can also always follow me at Ny-on-life. That's Naionlife.
Okay.
I'm always on a lot of different workshops, sometimes speaking at certain things. I just did the XO Nicole Made for Me conference, which was really
Yeah.
exciting. So hopefully more things like that in the future, and you can always catch up with me on Instagram.
Wonderful. Thank you again, and hopefully we'll speak with you again soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again to my guest, Naiylah Warren. I feel like I'm going to have to pay her after this. She's always coming with the gems and insights, and I know I've definitely learned a thing or two from this episode, and I hope that you all have as well. Now, if you listened to this podcast in the past, you know that we like to end every episode with what I call a mindful moment. Today's mindful moment comes to you from my precious 8-year-old, Naiylah. Enjoy.
Hello, my name is Naiylah, and I'd like to say a few words of encouragement for you. Life is hard, but you can get through it. Believe in yourself. Also, you are unique and special in your own way, and that's beautiful.